Good afternoon, Małgorzata Bonikowska, the Center for International Relations. Welcome from Warsaw. In this talk, the third one under the umbrella of the series we called The Four Takes on Middle East, we do together with ELNET-Polska. And we would like to talk about the situation in the Middle East, actually, especially because some important changes happened. We had a very difficult situation in Afghanistan, withdrawal of the American and Western allies from this country. And we are also 1 year after the Abraham Accords. So we would like just to sum up where we are. We also had a change in the Israel, important change of the government in the meantime. So let's just sum up all these changes. Let me first introduce our speakers from the Polish side, and then I will give the floor to our guests. Let me start with Patrycja Sasnal. Hello, Patrycja.
Hi, very nice to be here.
Yes, I'm delighted that you joined. Patrycja is actually the head of research in the Polish Institute of International Affairs, the public institution under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with whom we cooperate. And Pat is responsible, or is an expert on actually Middle East and especially Arabic countries. And is also, of course, political scientist and a philosopher, and writes books also. So congratulations. And then we have Jerzy Wójcik. Jerzy, hello.
Hello. Good
Jerzy
afternoon.
is actually our expert in the center, but he's also of the IZROPA Institute and a member of the European Association of Israel Studies, one of the best experts on Israel in Poland. So thank you, Jerzy, for being with us. And let me give the floor now to Marta Kubica from ELNET to introduce ELNET and also our foreign.
Thank you, Małgorzata. Hello, everyone. My name is Marta Kubica. I'm the Executive Director of ELNET-Poland. ELNET is a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to strengthening relations between Europe and Israel based on shared democratic values and strategic interests. That's why we're very happy to be joining this program together with the Center for International Relations. And we have two very special guests from Israel today with us. I will start with Ksenia. Ksenia Svetlova is the director of the program of Israel and Middle East relations, an expert on Middle Eastern studies, and a former member of the Knesset. Ksenia was born in Moscow, and her family immigrated to Israel in 1991. She holds a BA and MA in journalism and Middle Eastern studies from Hebrew University. She was also fluent in Arabic. And she had served for 14 years as a reporter and analyst on Arab affairs. She covered Gaza, West Bank. She reported from Tahrir Square, Damascus, Beirut, Manama, and Tripoli. She also is a well-known author. Her op-eds were published by many Israeli and international media. Also today, Ksenia chairs the Public Council for Israeli Society for International Development and is a research fellow at the Reichman University, which is formerly known as IDC Herzliya. Ksenia, welcome. I'm very happy that you're with us today. And our second guest is a very special guest that I believe everyone here knows very well, Ambassador Zvi Rav-Ner, former Israeli ambassador in Warsaw. Zvi Rav-Ner was born in Świdnica and immigrated to Israel at the age of 7. He obtained a degree in communications, television, cinema, and Hebrew literature at the Tel Aviv University. And after that, he joined the Israeli Foreign Service. He served as a diplomat in Helsinki, Bucharest, and several times in London. In the meantime, he also held twice the position of the director of Central Europe Department in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. His last mission abroad was Warsaw.
And we can add that he knows also Polish language. So actually,
he does speak perfect Polish.
Oczywiście.
Dzień dobry. So let's start. Let me start with Patrycja, because I would like, Patty, if you allow me just to ask you to have, to give us a kind of an overview of the situation in the Middle East, especially with the context of these changes, you know, and the Afghanistan's effect, which may here play a role. Taking into consideration also that you are an Arabist and you also speak Arabic, so maybe you can just balance this discussion also to give us this other side's perspective.
Right. Thank you very much, Małgorzata. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak my mind. I guess I would want to touch upon 3 points, 3 issues. But by way of introduction, I think that there's this looming process over the region, which is actually the long-term American withdrawal from the region. It does not, by saying this, I do not mean that the United States is or will be absent from the region, because even if they do completely withdraw from Syria, even if they have withdrawn from Afghanistan and will by the end of the year withdraw completely from Iraq, as is stated by a deal made with the Iraqi government, there will still be very large American military bases in the region, which makes a whole lot of difference. I mean, the Americans will be there, and with bases in Qatar, Bahrain, with great presence in Saudi Arabia, they will still be able to project their power and will be an aspect that other governments need to take into account. But this process of American withdrawal is happening, and I think it is noticed by regional actors. So my first point is the word reconciliation. And I see reconciliation processes in 2 tracks. One track is the Abraham Accords. So this is Israel making up with United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, a little bit with Oman, there's Saudi Arabia somewhere in between, or, you know, in the background of all this. So this is one process. The other reconciliation process that I think we don't talk enough about is the sort of pan-regional security architecture that is shaping up. And this was initiated with the Iranian-Saudi talks and Iranian-Saudi meetings. I want to underline that we're talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia. We are now after the 3rd round of the talks and meetings, and I know for sure that there have been bilateral talks between the 2. We are awaiting a 4th round of the talks between the 2 countries. These are mediated, negotiated by Iraq. The process might have been stopped a little bit, but that's because there is no new Iraqi government and other things are happening. And this reconciliation process, I mean, I did talk about this larger regional architecture because at the end of September, there was a conference in Baghdad. The name of the conference was something like Conference for Security and Cooperation, and it had to do with the future of Iraq mostly. But imagine Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, actually all regional actors, apart from Syria, were invited and came at a very high level. So some analysts would even compare this process or this first conference as a sort of prelude to what happened in Europe, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which then gave way to what is now OSCE. So these are the 2 processes under the word reconciliation. The second thing I believe needs to be mentioned is that we're in the midst of a long revolution in the Arab world, okay? So let me explain. We tend to think of 2011, the upheavals in the Arab world. Some call it revolutions, others would call it the Arab Spring. Regardless of the name we give it, the region and the societies are in the process of turbulent changes, but the pace of these changes, because these changes are societal rather than political, they are happening at a lower speed than political change would normally be happening. And so we do not maybe perceive it, but what happened in 2011 is still happening. And 2019, the upheavals in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, this has not ended. I mean, this vehement longing for a change is there in the Arab societies and regional societies, and we will wait a little bit till we see the fruit of that. But I think it's a very important, if not crucial, factor to look at the stability of the region and the current Arab governments, because a lot of them, most of them, are anti-democratic. And even recently in Tunisia, we saw this anti-democratic turn, which was actually, as far as we know, instigated to some extent by the United Arab Emirates. So this long revolution is happening in the Middle East, specifically in the Arab world.
I just wanted to ask if I understood correctly, because you used the word reconciliation. Is it really a reconciliation, or is it just a game of interest which changed?
Right. So I think the reason for this, what I call reconciliation, it might be the first step, but the reason for it is the American pullout of the Middle East. I think that regardless of regional conflicts, the actors, the countries, the states are realizing that they need to take their own problems in their own hands, because there will not be the United States to blame. There will not be the United States to help. So they need to deal with the realities by themselves. And hence you have those processes. Now, of course, the larger question is what happens between Israel and Iran, which I'm sort of leaving there, hoping that we'll be able to discuss it later. But at least it's a first step into the sort of reconciliation idea that we're used in Europe, for example. I'm not saying this has happened, but if, in all honesty, I've just come back from Iran, and it's the first time that I heard Iranians speak so warmly of Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, at least even in the rhetorical, at the rhetorical level, you already see a change. And I think it means something. So this is about the reconciliation. And then my final point about those larger regional processes is that even with the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and regardless what we think about it or what our assessment is, even with those pseudo-reconciliation, at least pseudo-reconciliation processes happening, there has been actually no diplomatic or political breakthroughs in any of the hot conflict fronts in the region. And here I mean Yemen, Syria, or Libya. Actually, Lebanon is exceedingly fragile. Also, you know, the Algerian-Moroccan conflict, which is an important conflict that has a bearing on North Africa in general. These relations have deteriorated. In Tunisia, as I said, there was this anti-democratic turn. So I think we're in a process of a fluidity that has this ingrained danger there, that some actors may overstate American presence and some may underestimate American presence. And based on those sort of mistaken calculations, they will make maybe mistaken moves, even with regard to their own interests. This is sort of a general idea that I leave for the end, but I'd be happy to discuss any of this in detail.
Thank you for this panorama. Really, the landscape seems quite complicated, and I would like now to ask every one of you to just react on what Patrycja has just said, my reaction from the European Union position, I did European studies, I'm an expert on the European Union. We just continue to have a ring of fire around our borders. It's not only the eastern border of Poland right now, but it seems that the Middle East and South is really unstable still. So maybe I will start with Your Excellency, Zvi Rav-Ner. Maybe you can comment on that as a diplomat in the foreign ministry since the 70s, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, hello. Well, of course, we are talking today and we are celebrating today the 1-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, which were really quite an achievement, but an achievement both in essence as well as, quite surprisingly, the rate, the speedy acceleration of relations between Israel and the Gulf states, something we haven't seen, for instance, in the long years of peace agreements with Egypt, for instance. In only 1 year, we have excellent relations with those countries in terms of trade, economic, health, and even military. In the last just a couple of days ago, a joint exercise, air exercise with the Americans, with the UAE Air Force. This is really within 1 year only. We haven't seen things like that before, not to mention that in spite of the COVID pandemic situation, something between 200,000 to 300,000 Israelis visited the Gulf just within 1 year. That's very remarkable, no doubt. And it is a reflection of the subject, the issue that is really maybe #1 topic and concern for Israel, and that is obviously Iran. The question of where those talks between the Iranians and Western powers are going to, the six are going to go within a couple of days. They are to be resumed. It's no secret that Israel is quite skeptical about it, and indeed was in a way taken back by the decision of United States to enter into those negotiations. There is a public debate about it here in Israel, whether the agreement with Tehran, with Iran on the nuclear issue, was it a good deal or was it a very bad deal? One way or the other, no doubt, and I think this is being agreed upon by all parties concerned, that the Iranians have made quite a substantial progress in their nuclearization, as well as in their systematic terrorist efforts throughout the region, and hence on our border, on our northern border, the situation in Syria with the Iranian elements.
But I would like to ask you a little bit more about this American factor Patrycja mentioned, because as a diplomat also, you can comment on what can we expect, because first of all, do you agree that, you know, this is really a key factor for the region, and then we can expect different reactions of the Arabic countries, and also maybe the Israel perspective changes as well?
Well, if you mean about the Arab countries, no. By the way, the accords, they are a reflection, and the accords and the temperature, the warm temperature of the acceleration of those relations, I think is as a whole a reflection of the shared concerns and interests of those countries with Israel vis-a-vis Iran, no doubt about it. Now, about the United States, indeed, Afghanistan was mentioned. Of course, any setback for United States in our region or elsewhere, after all, for Israel, United States, as for many other countries, indeed, the United States is the most vital, important, crucial, existential ally. So any American setback wherever, like in Afghanistan, of course, is a source of concern. But I would not go that far to say that that's it. The US is leaving the Middle East. Yes, it is changing the structure of its influence in the Middle East. Rightly or wrongly, we shall see. But we should not dismiss still the United States from this area altogether. And again, just a couple of days ago, this Air Force joint exercise here with the Gulf is quite important, and probably also indicating that the Americans are still here. And I don't think that the Americans can leave them. Of course, there is the China, Asia, South of Asia. That's of course very important for the Americans. But nevertheless, I think that the Americans cannot allow themselves to completely abandon this area in spite of the changes of global energy situation and so on. But look, we have here on our northern border a very important Russian presence. Therefore, well, just a couple of days ago, our Prime Minister Bennett went to Russia and sat 5.5 hours with President Putin. Indeed, at least according to foreign reports, Israel is very active militarily in Syria, almost every day or every week or every night, attacking Iranian military units in Syria. So this is how important. This is also, I think, very important for the United States, one way or the other. I think altogether, the Americans are still here and probably will continue to be here in some different kind of deployment, apparently.
Thank you. Maybe I will take now, I give the floor to Marta to continue with your question.
Thank you, Małgorzata. I wanted to still stay with the Abraham Accords, but actually ask, and Jurek, I would like to ask you this question first. There are voices that Europe actually should assist in leveraging Abraham Accords to re-engage with the Palestinian issue. How do you feel about that?
One of the major things about Abraham Accords when it comes to the Palestinians is that Palestinians, as simple as that is, they are no longer in the center of the contacts between Arab states and Israel. That actually break the pattern. For the first time, actually, when you think about the Saudi initiative, for instance, in 2002, when it was directly said that a peace agreement can be signed between Israel and the Arab states, moderate Arab states, if the Palestinians' case is included and if there's going to be a withdrawal from the 1967 territories. It's no longer there. Abraham Accords actually were much beyond that. Actually, Palestinians were left on the margin. And the fact that actually in the recent conflict between Hamas and Israel, this case did not break anyhow the relations between the moderate Arab states and Israel after Abraham Accords were signed. It only shows that actually Palestinians are no longer a part of the contract, so to speak. And that's the very interesting case. But the consequence of that is very dangerous, of course, because in this understanding, Israeli government may have a feeling that the two-state solution is no longer there. That this two-state solution is no longer on the agenda, and the situation that we have right now with the Palestinian territories can be permanent, or there might be other solution for the conflict. And you can actually find voices saying that actually there might be a one-state solution, there might be actually some other different strategies. And that's sometimes actually the voice of the Israeli government. But if you listen to the politicians on the West, including US, including Europe, there's no other solution to the conflict except the two-state solution. In the long run, in the horizon of 20, 30, 40 years, Palestinian state is the only possible solution. And this is something actually what I have a feeling Israeli politicians do not embrace. I think sometimes you can hear voices that actually there might be other solutions. But we have to understand, according to the law, according to the international stability, well, according to international law, and when we think about international stability, Palestinians were granted the right of the self-governance and self-determination in the 1970s. It cannot be taken back. It cannot be revoked anyhow. That's the law. That's the stability. These are the foundations. So when you think about the settlement, when you think about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the long run, the Palestinian state is only solution. And I'm going to go to the question that people ask quite often. So what about the Palestinian state right now? And going directly to the question that you asked. Today, Palestinian state cannot be formed. It's impossible. It's pointless. The Palestinian leadership is not in a position to control the Palestinian territories. And it's, when you even actually compare the situation of the Palestinian leadership today and 20 years ago, when Yasser Arafat was in power and the Camp David was about to be signed, Camp David Accords, Yasser Arafat was in the physical and effective control of the Palestinian territories. We don't have that situation right now. We have the Palestinian leadership actually very divided, very conflicted, very weak. We don't have the power extended over the Gaza Strip. Effectiveness of such a new body is questioned, and it's legitimate to question that. If we form actually the Palestinian state right now, it will only bring actually more violence. Another thing about that is actually even actually within the Palestinian movement, the narrative has not changed. That's the problem. Palestinians themselves are not really actually ready right now to what I believe is possible for the Palestinians to accept, to embrace.
But sorry to interrupt, but how this is contradictory to what you're saying, because how to resolve this dilemma? And from one side, by law, there is a state, and from the other side, in reality, the state cannot be, it's not in function. So what to do?
No, absolutely. Actually, we have to wait. I mean, there's no other way just to, well, as I said, actually, in the long run, the two-state solution is the only possible solution for the conflict. But in the current stage of the conflict, Palestinian state cannot be formed. Palestinians are not in a position actually to do that. And nobody can help them. So when you think about the Abraham Accords, I'm going to go back to the point that we made just a couple of moments ago. Palestinians are excluded from the Abraham Accords, which is in a way good, because that opened a new chapter of the relations between Israel and the more Arab states. On the other hand, there will be a hesitation and there will be sort of a push towards marginalizing Palestinian case, like from any other progress or any other developments. And that's the problem, that some people would be willing actually to forget about a two-state solution, or to say that actually Palestinians will not have the state ever in the future. In the long run, that's the only possible solution in my view. And many people actually emphasize that actually the two-state solution has to be there, if not in 20, if not in 30 years, maybe in 40 years. But that's the only solution.
Thank you, Jurek. I would like to give a floor to Ksenia right now. And actually, Ksenia, you're in completely different place, geographically, politically, I guess, as well. And I would like to ask you for, if you could comment on what just Jerzy said. So first of all, the fate of the Palestinian state, the Abraham Accords that basically cut out the Palestinian issue from the deal, but also the role of Europe in this whole thing. Do you believe that Europe should be involved, or it shouldn't?
I would like to say that, as we know, the Abraham Accords as an idea were formed by forces that are not necessarily supportive of the Palestinian cause, of the two-state solution idea. And this is, of course, the Trump administration, the Netanyahu administration, and the Arab states that understood during the last 20 years that they can benefit very much from the more closer connection with the United States and with Israel. But again, the Abraham Accords, it's mostly an idea, and this idea can be filled with various substances. Not only Palestinian issue was cut out from the Abraham Accords from the beginning, but also the relations between Israel and between the Arab countries, such as Jordan and Egypt. And this is vital relationship for Israel. I would appreciate that it's much more vital and important than relationship with countries with whom we do not share a common border. So always relationship with Jordan, relationship with Egypt, which weigh much more on the scale of the strategy, grand strategy of Israel in the Middle East than any other relationship with other Arab countries, which I do not underestimate them. No, but I do not think that also we have to now put all our weight in improving the bilateral relations between Israel and UAE. And here is where Europe is, coming in actually. So since no pressure was made on Israel during the last 4 years of Trump administration on the Palestinian issue, of course, there was also no movement. And I think there was movement on the opposite direction, away from the reality of the two-state solution and attempt to have things put on the ground, more settlements perhaps here and there. I do not think that it was incredible increase in building. There were more promises made than actually starting of some construction on the West Bank. But still, there were some laws that were accepted. There were some decisions that were made during the last 4 years that make the future possibility of disengaging from the Palestinians, whether on the basis of two-state solution or just simple disengagement, much more difficult. So when we are talking today about the possibility of developing the idea of the Abraham Accords, first of all, what can be done is, of course, coming back to the idea of the Mediterranean, the partnership of the Mediterranean, of course, extending it to the Persian Gulf, and including more actors. Israel will not win if it will continue ignoring the Palestinians in the way that we ignored and shunned during the last 4 years. In fact, we know that Benny Gantz met with Abu Mazen, and today the head of the Shin Bet met with Abu Mazen, because we know that if PA will collapse, then it will be such a mess that we will not be able to raise our head. We will be just completely sucked by dealing with these internal issues, while we have the most difficult challenge of Iran and Syria, which are not going anywhere despite the Abraham Accords. So basically, putting a bottom line for all of this, I would say that the Abraham Accords did not solve Israel regional issues, not with the Palestinians by just ignoring them. Of course, it would be foolish to assume that this idea would just disappear in the air just because we do not talk about it. This is in the way children do. They say, well, this, a monster doesn't exist. This idea does not exist. It's not going anywhere. The Iranian issue, well, if somebody thought that we are about to have this wonderful Arab NATO plus Israel plus United States to confront Iran, then surprise, this is not happening either. We see right now both Saudi Arabia with an encouragement, of course, with UAE. This is the country that is leading the processes today in the Gulf area, generally in the Arab Middle East. They are warming ties with Syria. They are warming ties with Iran. And this idea that we might use right now UAE to somehow confront Iran, how exactly? Military exercise together with the Emiratis, with Bahrainis are wonderful, but will it help us confront military Iran, either in Syria, Lebanon, or in the nuclear sphere? Unfortunately not. So Israel stays alone. This is the feeling that I get of loneliness. We are standing against right now US, which is not leaving completely the region, but it is distraught by other issues that are much more fundamental to it, such as China, yes, and Southeast Asia, of course. US perhaps is ready to make deals with Russia even in Syria. It says that it's not, but it seems that actually it is giving ready to give away some of the power, some of the responsibilities, because it doesn't want to be involved in Syria, which means that for a while we will have to confront on a daily basis growing Iranian influence in Syria. I do not buy this getting back Syria into the Arab nation family and by this pushing Iran out. In order to, and this is actually has to do something with Gaza too. If you want to take somebody arms in this area, it will not happen voluntarily. Not Hamas in Gaza, but also not Iran in Syria. You will have to physically take their arms from their hands. Until this is not happening, Israel is the only military force. This is confronting Iran in every possible sphere here. And I think the situation is actually very dangerous. It's getting more dangerous. I think the high hopes for transforming the Middle East through the Abraham Accords, it did not actually, decision makers dreamt that it will be a couple of years.
Ksenia, if I may add additional question to what you say, that you know Russia quite well. Can you comment a little bit about the Russians' presence in the region? And also the second question is taking into consideration a politician. How can you describe the political views in Israel right now with this complicated coalition on this two-state solution? What is the political debate around? What is the really, realistic that we can expect?
Well, thank you very much for this question. In Russia, I would say that, despite, that many experts believe that, Russia is working very sophisticated in a very sophisticated way. And this is why it succeeds to get some gains here in the Middle East. I would say that it uses the lack of interest of the Americans more than everything else. It sees the vacuum and it enters inside. It was able to enter for now only to the spheres that were vacant from American influence, which means, that, giving the reality in which we understand that Americans will make more steps away from the Middle East, even if not leaving it, of course, completely. But in the place where this, this vacuum of power, Russia immediately cedes its seeds, and it becomes stronger because of the, physical presence, geographical presence, by, for example, controlling right now a huge chunk of the Mediterranean. Well, it became not only a neighbor of Israel, but also of all of the Mediterranean European countries as well, because it now controls, the sea territory that are very close to them. I do not think that right now the core Arab countries, such as Egypt, for example, to swipe the American support with the Russian support. No, they are interested to play in all of the fields. Egypt is playing with Russia, it's playing with America, and it's doing not bad at all. It's also playing with the Chinese, who are building its new capital. And it will continue in this way. For Russia, Middle East is strategic. For America, it's no longer strategic. I think here lies the big difference. In regards to the view of the coalition, there is no view of the coalition, you see, because this is the differences are so fundamental, they're so huge between the various parties, that I think that the decision is to agree not to disagree for a while, not to act right now in to renew the negotiations, to come back to the negotiation table, because we know everything. And they know everything that we have to say. We know what they have to say. I think that the coalition, including its most left-wing parties, right now decided to put its weight on the economical stabilization in Palestinian autonomy. This is what they are busy with 24/7. For now, they've done already some steps. These steps are not enough. This is telling from being almost weekly right now in Ramallah. I can tell you this is definitely not enough. And some members of the coalition know it, while others think that Israel already, made some steps, and it's for now it should be enough. I think the Shin Bet understands it very well, because they're following, what is going on the ground. The situation is extremely fragile, and we can find ourselves again in some kind of appraisal in the camps, for example, Jenin, camps near Bethlehem, they are not quiet at all. This is a real danger, and we are not today in a situation. I completely agree with Jerzy to talk about a political solution for right now. But what we have to do is to keep the flame, burning. We have to keep this ability, the possibility in future to come back to the table and say, well, this is still a viable solution. This is still something that we can do. Maybe not today, but in 1, 2, 3 years from now.
Thank you, Ksenia. Let me come back to Patrycja. She started, and now I would like to ask you first on, Abraham Accords more, and also about this view on two-state solution, because it's quite important also for us Europeans, to understand what is realistic, and also what is the feeling in the region, taking into consideration what Jerzy said, that Palestinian case is not anymore crucial.
Yes, so I in the broadest of senses, I do agree with Jerzy and with Ksenia. But what I think is that there's now this feeling of, how to put it, like a new energy in the region in general, but also in Israel. I mean, both in the Israeli government, because it's such a special new government, because it's so diverse, because it needs to internally negotiate so many things. This is the Israeli part. And then on the Palestinian side, there's this wariness of the Palestinians with their authorities that keep doing over and over the same thing, that do not change, that there are no elections and all that. So I think that we might be surprised if by chance, by coincidence, some kind of an agreement may come, just out of the blue. I cannot really argument it otherwise than with the changes that I just mentioned, but I don't think that things are now more gloomy and doomed than they were a year ago. I think that this fluidity, this new fluidity, increases outcomes that had normally been unthinkable. So this is on the Palestinian issue. Now, when it comes to the Abraham Accords, I think Zvi Rav-Ner, you mentioned that there is this economic cooperation flourishing. I actually did a bit of research recently into the follow-on from the Abraham Accords when it comes to economy. And of course, the accords are there, and the trade volume with the UAE has already reached $500 million, and it's forecasted, and I'm looking at the data, to reach 10 billion mark at the end of the decade. Still, due to the pandemic and the freshness of these relations, it is really hard to properly assess them and the potential in the long term. Needless to say, releasing economic relations from formal limits will allow them to grow, although I think still the social attitude, the attitude is negative. On the Arab side, it will take longer time to change depending on the political relations. Now, what is important from the European perspective, the Abraham Accords are a positive development, establishing diplomatic relations where there had been none before always adds to the interconnectedness, potential for dialogue, and it trickles to other spheres of contact. All these are really specifically important in a region that is so conflicted and is the least integrated economically region in the world. Yet, I think there are two problems that could surface in the future. Firstly, it would really be detrimental to general security if the Abraham Accords turn to mean solely the tightening of this anti-Iranian camp, and thus will sharpen regional conflicts. That would cloud, I think, any positive ties, economic or otherwise, that may develop simultaneously between the Arab states and Israel. It will be therefore interesting to watch Israeli-Arab relations if they indeed manage to go beyond this fixation, I think, on Iran, and if they will be able to create genuine new paths for economic or social cooperation. Secondly, sort of disproportionately, incommensurately strong cooperation in military and surveillance technologies at the expense of, other sectors, could add to instability in the broader Middle East. Propping up Arab autocrats, and this is what we hear in the media, right, in the form of facilitating civil society invigilation or strengthening the security sector of undemocratic states, raises obvious concerns. Although needless to say, European countries are not guilt-free in this regard. But a single issue of this Israeli Pegasus phone hacking spyware, which is known to have been used by repressive rulers of the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, is detrimental to the overall assessment of Israeli-Arab relations by Arab societies on the one hand, and I think it also damages the perception of Israeli-Arab relations in Europe. It also sort of bolsters forces of the undemocratic structure in the Arab world. With the Arab Societal Agency, like I said, with the long revolution, this Arab societal agency is still in the process of building up, and with a good degree of probability, I believe, will stand up to the current rulers in the longer term. And I think Israel would not be well positioned then if it rested their relations with the undemocratic Arab rulers solely on the military and AI cooperation.
Thank you, Patrycja. I just think the ambassador would like to react, but I would have also one more question to you, Zvi Rav-Ner, about if you can just describe as a diplomat also, what is really and what will be, taking into consideration the government in Israel is quite complicated, the foreign policy of Israel in the next months and years?
Look, as I said, the list of priorities of this Israeli government is no doubt first and foremost Iran and the question of nuclearization, then Syria in relation to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is considered here as a direct threat to all of us here in Israel. So this is a very pressing, those are very pressing matters. I have to say honestly, and it was mentioned here again and again, the Palestinian issue at the moment is really quite weak. I do understand the potential threat of uprising, or to say intifada and so on. Nevertheless, one way or the other, it is being considered at the moment in Israel, and I think not only in Israel, as whatever that there is a need to do to undertake steps mentioned also economic facilitation with the Palestinian autonomy and so on, but there is no way at the moment to reach a solution. There is no way at the moment, both because of the political situation in Israel and this government, which is really an unprecedented government in Israel, from the very right to the very left. Remember that there is one of the parties in the government is actually some kind of a party which could be considered as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Ra'am and Abbas Mansour. So this is an unbelievable political setup from the very right to the very left, and therefore it is not imaginable that they will be able to tackle the Palestinian problem. Moreover, it's interesting, and in this respect, Abraham Accords are important. Well, we shouldn't rely on that. As far as Iran, I agree as mentioned before, but the very fact that it was possible, in spite of the fact that no progress on the Palestinian issue. One more thing, Gaza. In May, we had the last military conflict in Gaza. And it was very interesting to observe that in Arab countries, the reaction was quite weak, actually. One of the results of the conflict that Egypt came back to the scene, and Egypt is now playing a very important role in trying to resolve the problems of Gaza. But moreover than that, as far as the Palestinian Authority is concerned, one could notice something very interesting, that solidarity with Gaza in Ramallah was far less stronger and visible than in some of the Israeli Arab cities within Israel by Arab Israeli citizens in Lod and Ramle and Akko and so on, where there were violent clashes taking place. So the temperature of the resistance, say, or the solidarity with Gaza was far more stronger here inside Israel than outside in the Arab autonomy or in any other Arab country. In the past, I mean, when we had this country in the 90s, when we had the Oslo agreements on, actually they are still on the Oslo agreements. We never went back on them. But each time we had these kind of situations, or later, there were very strong reactions in the Arab world. This time in May, very, very weak reactions in essence. So it's, yeah, look, I also do believe, and I always believed in the two-state solution, and I don't know what other solution is possible whatsoever. By the way, in the last couple of weeks, there is a very fierce debate here in Israel between experts, military experts, politicians, not politicians, but more academics. Some say that the two-state solution is simply not possible anymore because of the settlements. 500,000 Jews living in the West Bank, that's it, it's impossible. And of course, taking into account also what happened in Gaza when Israel withdrew from Gaza, and now Gaza is firing rockets on Israel. So it's unimaginable that we would allow such a situation in the West Bank. And there are some new solutions, or maybe not exactly new, not very new, but nevertheless more than before, talking about possibility of some kind of confederation between Israel and the Palestinian autonomy, one way or the other. It's interesting that most of the discussion is within the academic circles of Israel and not of the political circles of Israel, because the whole problem looks at the moment, and I do agree with what Ksenia said about the potential, the very explosive potential of a situation. But nevertheless, at the moment, it looks like more an academic issue than a real issue.
Let us ask Ksenia, because actually you, and of course, yourself, in your presence, you combine the two, political environment and political activity, and also being professor at the university, so academic circles. First, I would like you to react on what was said, but also a wider question concerning the elements which can really, in your view, bring some stability to the region, which is absolutely crucial for us.
I think that my answer to your second question is simple. If I knew what would be the solution, I would be already the recipient of the Nobel Prize. If I knew how to stabilize Middle East, yeah, well, okay, it's a little bit tough. I would say that, as with everything, you need to combine, the political approach with economic recovery and seeking justice, because the dimension of justice is often overseen overlooked. And without talking about justice, I think it will be difficult also to find not a solution, but I think a remedy to the long-term processes and conflicts that are burning in our region. And of course, I'm referring also to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In general, Patrycja mentioned that one of the effects of rapproching between Israel and the Arab states was also the increasing of the support and the facilitation of the abilities of the autocratic regimes. I have to tell you, Patrycja, that the Israeli official line, and nobody will tell you this, and you're looking at your eyes. But since I'm not in the political milieu right now anymore, I'm more of the researcher and the journalist. I can tell you this. Israel, incredibly, believes in the power of autocrats, especially Arab autocrats here in the Middle East, because the paradigm is that either you have Islamic insurgency or you are working somehow your way with the Arab autocrats. And I can tell you that the cry over Hosni Mubarak's fate on 25th of January 2011, I think Israel cried more for Mubarak than his own circle did. Because many felt at this moment that this is basically the end of the story. This is the end of Camp David. This is the end of security relations. This is the end of even cold but still peace. Our soldiers are not dying on the border with Egypt for many years now. So we will take cold peace any day over a warm war. With some new element that we do not know how to deal. I personally, for autocrats, will mean eventually that it's a catch-22. More repressions will mean, in the end of the day, more revolutions and more uprisings and more destabilization. You do not have right now an alternative between good and bad. You do not have an alternative between autocrat and a democratic rule right now, not in Egypt, not in Palestinian autonomy, not even in Tunisia, apparently. This all strengthens the idea of, well, let us, cooperate together for the stability that we have, at least in some parts of the Middle East, to prevent a greater destabilization. I would say that this theory is flawed, yes, because it lacks the understanding of the long-term processes. The Arab Spring that you mentioned rightly, that it's not over, it's ongoing issue that will still trouble us. I would say that building on the results of the opinion polls, various opinion polls, the Arab Barometer, the Arab Youth parameters that we received, also the Midvim poll that we handled just recently, the economic stabilization is an important factor. And things can be calmed down a little bit due to economic stabilization. However, it's very far from being the 100% of the answer to any problem, to any conflict, and so on. So when we are talking about, for example, promoting things, with the Palestinians, of course, somebody needs to put the money right now. Understand the problem that the European Union has with putting the money in PA, because many of us know where this money is going. The PA doesn't have a good record. But again, we are not choosing between good and bad here. We are choosing between collapse and its results, and between having this, dying body still, existing for some time until we have some transitional element that we will be able to work with them. For now, there is nothing of a kind. So I think that the situation, it looks calm, and most of Israelis did. According to our poll of Midvim, only 5% are really interested in the solution of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. It's unbelievable. 5%. This is it. People are not remotely interested in what is happening. But this is because we have calm. If we will have now a renewal of some hostilities with Gaza or in West Bank or in Jerusalem, which is the most dangerous of them all, because then I think it will also shake in also the Abraham Accords and other countries. Then I think that also the view of the public opinion view, it will change very quickly.
Ksenia mentioned catch-22. I think that's exactly what we think in Europe about what is going on in the world. It's our own, weakness. We feel this asymmetry, ourselves wanting this democracy and democratic system to be stronger while facing more and more authoritarian partners, if we can call them partners on the other side. So the last question goes to Jerzy. We started with an analyst and we end with an analyst this talk. Jerzy, if I can ask you for some suggestions for the EU, for the European Union. We know that, Americans withdraw. Russia, as Ksenia mentioned, uses all the gaps and enters in all the gaps. What should the EU do in such situation?
Before I get into this, let me just share actually my conclusion when I hear all of you today. I think we all agree, or I believe we should agree on that. Actually, we live in a very transitory period of time when it comes to the Middle East. Israel doesn't have the concrete government. Actually, it's also kind of a transitory government. Palestinian situation is very transitory as well. Even Abraham Accords are also in a very early stage. I think we're all waiting Saudi Arabia to enter the scene of Abraham Accords, to have this sort of partnership, and then we can see where that is really going. So that's just all a very shaky, unstable situation, transitory situation on many fronts. When it comes to European Union, that's the very difficult subject, and especially, and I'm gonna just get into actually the situation when it comes to the Palestinians. Europe and European politicians has to, in a way, open their eyes and see actually the Palestinian, as some of you actually mentioned, the Palestinians are not in a position to establish the state, but the first thing. The second thing, actually, the European funds has to be more controllable. In other words, actually, they had to be under a certain control before Europe actually decided to support or to finance any more developments of in the Palestinian territories. We may not think about it, but U.S. currently, Biden administration is the first administration that doesn't have any concrete and not even willingness to propose any sort of the Israeli-Palestinian settlement. In other words, that's the first administration that doesn't have the ambition to become the broker. I think that's the first situation in the last actually 25 or 30 years. So Europe will be, I'm not going to say actually a crucial element when it comes to the Palestinian Israelis, but the involvement of the European Union, financial involvement in the Palestinian territories, will be crucial, and Europe has to be more open-minded when it comes to the transitory stage in the Palestinian developments. In other words, it has to be more flexible. Europe has to be more flexible when it comes to the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. Europe cannot be so much linked to the idea of the 1967 borders. Very often you can find actually those still phrasing in the European politicians that 1967 Green Line, that's something, that's the border, that's going to be the future Palestinian state. As many of you actually mentioned, lots of Israeli settlements, there will have to be much more flexible solution in the future. Europe has to embrace the new concepts as well. That cannot be so much orthodox when it comes to the old situation, like even a couple of decades ago. So that's my prediction, that Europe has to be more flexible.
Thank you, Jerzy, for this. It's more to reflect upon, and definitely it's not the last of the takes on Middle East we are inviting you for. Thank you all the panelists today. Let me thank Patrycja Sasnal, Ksenia Svetlova, Zvi Rav-Ner, and Jerzy Wójcik, and Marta Kubica. Of course, thanks ELNET for this cooperation, and see you next time.